The Startup Retro is a new podcast from the team behind Overnight Success.
A weekly show where we help you level up on the Australian startup ecosystem by giving you an insider's view on Aussie startups and venture capital. I'm Will Richards.
And I'm Gemma Clancy.
At OS, we curate the most important news and announcements across the ecosystem and explain a bit of useful context behind them.
The Startup Retro podcast will follow a format familiar to our readers of the weekly newsletter, but offer an opportunity for much more discussion.
So, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of all things happening Aussie startups and venture capital, start your week by listening to the Startup Retro. New episodes every Monday, starting the 1st of July.
The Startup Retro is brought to you by Day One, the podcast network for founders, operators, and investors.
Are they on the offensive or are they on the defensive? Because ultimately you can look at CDR and think of, is it really glass half full or is it half empty?
Welcome to FinTech Fun. FinTech Fun is a podcast where Australian fintechs come to share their stories. Hello, it's Chris Titley here. As part of the FinTech Fun podcast, I'm joined by Jill Berry, a co-founder of Adatree. Jill, thanks so much for coming on the series and being part of it all.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. Nice to chat to you.
Jill, let's talk about Adatree, the early days, and even yourself, how the business began and why the business began, going back to the early days.
Yeah, absolutely. Last month we celebrated our 3-year anniversary, and it just seems like it's been ages. Really, I've learned a whole lot. If I was a betting woman, I would have definitely bet that I would have never started a company at all. I've always been very happy as a product developer, but I think that ultimately those ways really got the best of me. I've always worked in product development, going from 0 to 1 in different banks, working on different products and services and payments. And then when I was building my second bank with my co-founder Shane, I love the idea of getting rid of legacy tech, legacy thinking, so you can have better consumer outcomes, and really only thought about banking for that. The consumer data right legislation came out, and I started to really pour into it. This is such an economy-wide thing. It's beyond banking, but kind of copied and pasted from what it takes to build a bank, in terms of security standards and keeping up with all the technical complexities. It's really hard. So I love the idea of where it can go, but if you didn't have a solution in market, then ultimately you wouldn't bring any use cases to life. So we wanted to do the heavy lifting of it, be the intermediary. So to enable other fintechs and lots of other companies to provide better consumer services and products. So decided to quit our jobs, had a lean business canvas, did a lot of hypotheses and pretty much did exactly that. So definitely never planned on being CEO or really running the company, but it was really about a love for the potential of what the CDR could really do for consumers and being the pioneer in a big greenfield market.
Yeah, right, Jill, and that was 2020, I think July 1, when sort of things came out and about. But maybe for the listeners out there, you want to talk about CDR and what it is in its own right, and then the application use, which I'd like to delve into.
Yeah, absolutely. The consumer data right is a regulated data sharing regime that basically gives consumers the rights about, who holds your data, for what purpose, can they delete it, can they sell it, lots of other things that before companies would just hold it and be like, well, if you're my customer, this is mine. Sorry, this isn't yours. It totally flips it on its head. So that's so to change that social principle of, well, the company doesn't own your data, you own your data. There's a lot of technical, frameworks that really have to go along with it. But well, how do you enable, Chris's person to transfer all of his banking data or energy data to really where you want to go? Or how do you enforce that a company has to delete everything about you instead of sell it? What are they're looking at the regulatory framework. So ultimately it's an economy-wide framework. It's often called open banking. That's where it started, but it will go anywhere from, it'll definitely go into finance, superannuation, telco, energy, payments, really just going economy-wide. So it's basically the technical regulatory implementation about how you own your own data and you can control it.
And Jill, the use cases a couple of years later, and how Adatree fits in, and I suppose the maybe the kickback or the sort of the revolt against why maybe in a couple of years it hasn't really kicked off, and maybe compare where we are to overseas in the US and the UK.
Yeah, so there's no regulated data sharing in the US. It's largely, private API connections or, just password sharing really. But you really don't have any control with that. It's open banking really started in the UK, but it was just looking at not necessarily anything economy wide. But they do have payments in there as well. So right now you can send data here, but you can initiate payments, outside the CDR. That will hopefully come into, or that'll go live, in the coming months and years. I know that the new Labour government just reiterated their commitment to the CDR, and action initiation is a really big thing of it. So I know that especially during COVID, so many there's millions of payments in the UK now made through open banking. So instead of you paying on your card somewhere, or like having operational overhead, or essentially just like a whole lot of fraud, expensive payments, and there's a really big float, essentially owned by the schemes. Now you can do account to account. Everything's really authorized, whether it's like a one-off or a recurring basis, and there's I think that there's lots of different use cases of, well, how can you look at someone's data and or make a payment off the back of it? So it's a better consumer outcome. It's more secure, and there's some pretty cool use cases. Like most of the time you think about kind of like the low hanging fruit. Like, how can I view my accounts in one place, or how can I have a really streamlined credit assessment? But there's also ones that you can look at, well, how can you support vulnerable people? If, say if you have, or like an older relative who you're worried about their finances, or you don't want them to get scammed, or maybe they really can't take care of themselves. And how do you balance privacy and utility? And how can you use open banking in that? So they can essentially authorize you to, have oversight of it, without having, them relinquishing full control. So there's, it's well outside banking, but how do you go into social services or energy, or how can you transition people to even a green economy? How can you use CDR to get more people into solar, or think about, well, what's the real payback period of, do I go solar and battery? Lots of different really interesting ways, well outside, well, just faster lending.
Yeah, on that front, in regards to the people that are like the institution themselves, for instance, if I want to do a budget, want to do a budget and I use a budgeting app, then I can integrate to my bank. There's probably a simple use case on that front. But then from that bank's point of view, how are they sort of encouraging people to do it, or are they sort of a little bit lapsed because they're thinking, oh, maybe people are using our data to leave and do something else?
Well, it's a question of, are they on the offensive, or are they on the defensive? Because ultimately you can look at CDR and think of, is it really glass half full, or is it half empty? Because if you're just giving away your data and there's other companies with cool services and propositions, then they're going to be engaging your customers, and the probability of you being a commodity, like product service provider in the background, really increases.
Yep.
So it's, companies have to share their data, otherwise they are subject to a whole lot of, civil and corporate fines, really. But it's a question of, well, how can we just get away from the stick? How can you go to the carrot? Because retention really won't be able to be as much of a strategy in the future, but, well, how can you really engage them? So I think it's a question of, instead of just sharing data, how can you receive it, and how can you do something really compelling to differentiate yourself and ultimately solve a problem for people? I think that a lot of the thinking is really going from a compliance focus to a competitive advantage focused. It's like, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yep.
Otherwise, look, some other companies could easily just steal your customer base, and what can you really do about it?
And then thinking outside the square, which some of the industries that you mentioned before, when a company or an entrepreneur thinks of an idea or thinks of an application use, then they come to you. Is that how Adatree works and fits in regards to assisting, use cases with open banking and CDR, broadly speaking?
Yeah, there's lots of different companies and industries who are interested in CDR, and some of them are like, I'm going to create this whole new business, and leverage a CDR for it. We can enable that, or we kind of call those like the smarter use cases when you're creating something from scratch, but like realistically from like a risk and an implementation and timing point of view. Most of the use cases that are first are saying, oh, I use this and this is what I do. I might have like a manual upload of my data, or I do some manual entering, or this is really, really slow, or I use password sharing and that's kind of broken right now. So how can we improve something? How can we make it smoother? So ultimately, I love to know people's use cases, but my tech is the same regardless. It caters for all different like industries.
Yeah, it's very broad, and also
companies.
you're leveraging the fact that people come up with ideas and entrepreneurs, which will hopefully, broadly speaking, encourage more people to be a part of the whole system, and then therefore the benefits will shine through at a macro level.
We're actually doing a post soon, just because we have lots of different use case ideas, even just being like, oh, here's 10 companies that you could create from scratch that leverage a CDR that wasn't even possible before. So like that type of stuff. So sure, I can make a playbook. Someone's got to implement it, but we can enable it.
And in regards to your current progress and some features that you've built out, can you give the listeners a bit of color around what's been happening at Adatree?
Yeah, so we've really nailed open banking. We're the only company that's connected to every data source around. We've been onboarding a whole lot of companies as clients with different use cases. I think like two key things. One, really going into energy. Like I say, CDR isn't just open banking; it's economy wide, and we're the only intermediary that's actually supporting open energy going into November. So we already have a number of open energy clients. It's a really big change about how, the launch of open banking versus open energy. Open banking, people are like, what's CDR? Why should I stop screen scraping? What's this? As opposed to open energy. They're like, this is my use case. Let's go. And so we're like, cool, let's go.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
Yes.
another a blueprint, I suppose, for an industry that can be replicated across multiple industries, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think we like to use the word scalable and repeatable.
Yeah, you stole the words out of my mouth.
And then we're also looking at we've launched the world's first open data marketplace called the Adatree Exchange. So as you can imagine, a lot of companies are like, give me access to data, and then we do that for them. But they're like, can you do this? Can you build this for me? Can you categorize it? Can you initiate payments? What else can you do? And I always like to say that companies die of indigestion, not starvation. There's always too many things to do. And
I haven't heard that before, but I think I'm going to use that in the future.
Yeah, feel free to steal it. I'm sure I sold it to someone else, not that original. But when just thinking about, if someone wants to implement a use case, and instead of being, thinking about, well, how do they assess and integrate all these other capabilities? Like, that's what we do. All these other companies who are really good at what they're doing, we collect the data and they might categorize it or verify account information, lots of different little add-ons. So ultimately it's a menu that you can pick and choose, integrate once with us, so you can really accelerate your use cases without having 10 different contracts and 10 integrations. That's the last thing you'd want to do.
And when we repeat this conversation in 12 months' time, where do you see the business? Where do you see the growth? You mentioned different sectors, and from the listeners out there, is it very legislative? So you're probably restrictive to going overseas, or can you actually do that from where you are locally?
Yeah, Lots to unpack in that one for sure. So I think that in 12 months, we'll have so many different use cases live, really looking at data and payments together. Even if action initiation isn't live, we'll be working with other payment companies just to look at like a really refined consent flow, or how do we leverage CDR insights, which is kind of like a low risk yes or no that might be about your account ownership balance, and combining that with payments as well. And then really just looking forward to the different use cases, not just about open banking, but open energy and getting ready for other industries. So we're having a lot of inquiries from, say, superannuation or insurance. So they're like, what are my use cases? Because even though we enable a whole lot of things, it has to start with the strategy of, well, what problem are you solving? What solution are you creating? Or, or what new competitive advantage are you creating for your company? And of course, as a consumer. So I think that CDR is a really big tipping point. And if I had one big thing on my wish list, it'd be starting to ban screen scraping, for sure.
Yep. Very good. And this podcast is called FinTech Fun, and it would be a pretty boring podcast if there wasn't much fun involved. So let's talk about Jill, the person. What does Jill do when you want to switch off, when you've got so much going through your head in regards to industries and open banking and add in things like blockchain? Do you get to wind down, and what do you do when you wind down?
I think just I will more like locally on a day-to-day basis. I live in Bondi and I try to jump in the water all the time, even during the winter. I'll go in.
How cold is it at the moment? Is it okay? Is it manageable, or do you just push yourself to go through?
It's definitely manageable. It'd be around 17.
Yep.
But,
so you go for a swim, and you've got a bit of a slight non-Aussie twang in your accent. Can you talk about your background, where you've come from, and where that's originated from?
Yeah, so I'm from Niagara Falls in the US. It'll get down to negative 30-ish
Right.
in the winter. So I've actually had only cold holidays. I was just thinking about it the past few days. I'm like, how come I haven't been to Queensland yet? Kind of as the beaches. It's like even January we went skiing in Utah. Recently just I went camping and kind of like just like in Tasmania.
My minor geographic knowledge says that Niagara Falls sits on both sides of either one on Canada, one on the US. Which one are you from?
I'm from the US side.
You're from the US side. Do you get back to the US? You mentioned Utah as now with COVID sort of still being pretty rampant, but do you intend to go back? Do you get back there a little often?
I think pre-COVID, I would go back, 2 to 4 times a year.
Yep.
And just being like, oh, I'm going to go to this wedding, or maybe I'm going to go to a bachelorette in New Orleans, or I'm going to go to, a birthday party in Vegas. But just like carry on.
It's been restrictive of that. And one piece of advice is the last thing we do in this sort of podcast is one piece of advice for other startup founders. You're 3 years into the journey. You've seen high highs and low lows and everything in between. But is there something which you could suggest to other first-time founders?
I would say focus on how revenue can be your best form of capital. There will be market, ups and a lot of promises and, just inflated valuations. Of course, there's a lot of that, has happened, especially last year. But for a really sustainable business, just focusing on revenue, even, supplement that with grants and credits.
Yep.
That is like one of my early investors absolutely drilled that into me. So revenue is your best form of capital, and that's what I basically say, every day. I think that's what makes us into a really sustainable business as well.
Jill, on that note, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for telling
It wasn't very fun, but
oh, wasn't okay? You want to go into some more fun? Okay, well that was that's business fun, I suppose. Well, is there anything else that you want to tell me about fun? Do you have any interests or side hobbies that no one knows about? Can I get an exclusive here?
An exclusive? Oh my gosh. I feel like on paper it looks really good. I'm in my 10th season of life saving. But realistically,
there you go. That's down at Bondi. That's what, how many hours do you do, or what's the schedule like during the season of life saving?
All right, you do about 40 to 60 hours a season. But it's been a tough few seasons because all of our clients have been gone, and it's not particularly fun when you watch people who are locals who could swim. There's not much to do.
Right, but might be some people that once the borders open freely and well, they're already open freely, but in terms of access to travel becomes a lot easier. We'll get an influx of tourists again, I'd imagine. And speaking of that, Bondi in its own right, I mean, is it still got the same vibe that it was a couple of years ago, or is there a little bit missing?
I think that there's a little bit missing because I've lived here for 12, 13 years now. And I think I just love to see like so many visitors. Those are the people who are like, very nice and keep us busy on the beach.
Yep.
But we just love walking around and having like the bars and restaurants absolutely full and people just really enjoying themselves. So I'm really, really hoping that this summer is going to be like a classic Bondi summer, like, kiss COVID goodbye.
Well, Lifesaver Jill, thank you very much for the podcast and to give us the history of Adatree as well as the progress that you've seen thus far and your future plans. It's been a pleasure to have a chat and as I said, look forward to chatting in the future and seeing how you're going, and let me know if I can help along the way.
Of course. Thanks so much, Chris, and congratulations on your new endeavor.
Thank you.
For more information on Sub 11, jump onto our LinkedIn or email me, chris@sub11.com.au. Thanks for listening.
The Startup Retro is a new podcast from the team behind Overnight Success.
A weekly show where we help you level up on the Australian startup ecosystem by giving you an insider's view on Aussie startups and venture capital. I'm Will Richards.
And I'm Gemma Clancy.
At OS, we curate the most important news and announcements across the ecosystem and explain a bit of useful context behind them.
The Startup Retro podcast will follow a format familiar to our readers of the weekly newsletter, but offer an opportunity for much more discussion.
So, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of all things happening Aussie startups and venture capital, start your week by listening to the Startup Retro. New episodes every Monday, starting the 1st of July.
The Startup Retro is brought to you by Day One, the podcast network for founders, operators, and investors.